The Saint Valentine's Day Massacre was the murder of 7 members and associates of Chicago's North Side Gang on Saint Valentine's Day 1929. The men were gathered at a Lincoln Park, Chicago garage on the morning of February 14, 1929. They were lined up against a wall and shot by 4 unknown assailants, 2 of whom were disguised as police officers. The murders resulted from the competition for control of organized crime in the city during Prohibition between the largely Irish Northsiders, headed by George "Bugs" Moran, and their largely Italian Chicago outfit rivals led by Al Capone. The perpetrators have never been conclusively identified, but former members of the Egan's Rats gang working for Capone are suspected of involvement. Others have said that members of the Chicago Police Department who allegedly wanted revenge for the killing of a police officer's son played a part. At 10:30 in the morning on St. Valentine's Day, Thursday, February 14, 1929, 7 men were murdered at the garage at 2122 North Clark Street, to 3 in the Lincoln Park neighborhood of Chicago's North Side. They were shot by 4 men using weapons that included 2 Thompson submachine guns. 2 of the shooters were wearing police uniforms, while the others were wearing suits, ties and overcoats and hats. Witnesses saw the men in police uniforms leading the other men at gunpoint out of the garage after the shooting. The victims included 5 members of George "Bugs" Moran's North Side Gang. Moran's second-in-command and brother-in-law Albert Koshelek alias James Clark was killed along with Adam Hayer, the gang's bookkeeper and business manager, Albert Weinshank, who managed several cleaning and dyeing operations for Moran, and gang enforcers Frank Gusenberg and Peter Gusenberg. 2 associates were also shot: Reinhard H. Schwimmer, a former optician-turned-gambler and gang associate, and John May, an occasional mechanic for the Moran gang. Chicago police officers arrived at the scene to find that victim Frank Gusenberg was still alive, despite having sustained 14 bullet wounds. He was taken to the hospital, where doctors stabilized him for a short time and police tried to question him. When the police asked him who did it, he reportedly replied, "I won't talk. For God's sake, get me to a hospital." He died 3 hours later. The massacre was an attempt to eliminate Bugs Moran, head of the North Side Gang. Al Capone, who was at his Florida home at the time, was widely assumed to have been responsible for ordering the massacre. 5. The impetus for the plan may have been the North Side Gang's hijacking of some expensive whiskey being illegally smuggled by Capone's gang from Canada across the Detroit River. Moran was the last survivor of the North Side gunmen. His succession had come about because his similarly aggressive predecessors, Jaime Weiss and Vincent Drucci, had been killed in the violence that followed the murder of their original leader, Dean O'Banion. Several factors contributed to the timing of the plan to kill Moran. Moran and Capone had been vying for control of the lucrative Chicago bootlegging trade. Moran had also been muscling in on a Capone-run dog track in the Chicago suburbs, and he had taken over several saloons that were run by Capone, insisting that they were in his territory. Earlier in the year, North Sider Frank Gusenberg and his brother Peter unsuccessfully attempted to murder Jack McGurn. The North Side Gang was complicit in the murders of Pasqualino Patsy Lolordo and Antonio the Scourge Lombardo. Both had been presidents of the Unione Siciliana, the local mafia, and close associates of Capone. The plan was to lure Moran to the ZMC Cartage warehouse on North Clark Street on February 14, 1929, to kill him and perhaps 2 or 3 of his lieutenants. It is usually assumed that the North Siders were lured to the garage with the promise of a stolen, cut-rate shipment of whiskey, supplied by Detroit's Purple Gang, which was associated with Capone. The Gusenberg brothers were supposed to drive 2 empty trucks to Detroit that day to pick up 2 loads of stolen Canadian whiskey. All of the victims were dressed in their best clothes, with the exception of John May. As was customary for the North Siders and other gangsters at the time, most of the Moran gang arrived at the warehouse by approximately 10:30 a.m., but Moran was not there, having left his Parkway Hotel apartment late. He and fellow gang member Ted Newberry were approaching the rear of the warehouse from a side street when they saw a police car nearing the building. They immediately turned and retraced their steps, going to a nearby coffee shop. They encountered gang member Henry Gusenberg on the street and warned him, so he turned back. North Side gang member Willie Marks also spotted the police car on his way to the garage and ducked into a doorway and jotted down the license number before leaving the neighborhood. Witnesses outside the garage saw a Cadillac sedan pull up to a stop in front of the garage. 4 men emerged and walked inside, 2 of them dressed in police uniform. The 2 fake police officers carried shotguns and entered the rear portion of the garage, where they found members of Moran's gang and associates Reinhard Schwimmer and John May. Capone's lookouts likely mistook one of Moran's men, probably Albert Weinshank, who was the same height and build, for Moran himself. The physical similarity between the two men was enhanced by their dress that morning. Both happened to be wearing the same color overcoats and hats. Who was fixing one of the trucks? The fake policeman then ordered the men to line up against the wall, then signaled to the pair in civilian clothes who had accompanied them. Two of the killers opened fire with Thompson submachine guns, one with a 20-round box magazine and the other a 50-round drum. They were thorough, spraying their victims left and right, even continuing to fire after all 7 had hit the floor. 2 shotgun blasts afterward all but obliterated the faces of John May and James Clark, according to the coroner's report. Give the appearance that everything was under control. The men in street clothes came out with their hands up, prodded by the 2 uniformed policemen. Inside the garage, the only survivors in the warehouse were May's dog Highball and Frank Gusenberg, despite 14 bullet wounds. He was still conscious, but he died 3 hours later, refusing to identify the killers. Peter Gusenberg, a front-line enforcer for the Moran organizations. Frank Gusenberg, the brother of Peter Gusenberg and also an enforcer. Albert Koshelek alias James Clark, Moran's second-in-command. Adam Hayer, the bookkeeper and business manager of the Moran gang. Reinhard Schwimmer, an optometrist who had abandoned his practice to gamble on horse racing and associate with the gang. Albert Weinshank, who managed several cleaning and dyeing operations for Moran. His resemblance to Moran is allegedly what set the massacre in motion before Moran arrived, including the clothes that he was wearing. John May, an occasional car mechanic for the Moran gang. The Valentine's Day Massacre set off a public outcry which posed a problem for all bosses of the National Crime Syndicate. 10 within days, Capone received a summons to testify before a Chicago grand jury on charges of federal prohibition violations, but he said he was too unwell to attend. It was common knowledge that Moran was hijacking Capone's Detroit-based liquor shipments, and police focused their attention on Detroit's predominantly Jewish Purple Gang. Landladies Mrs. Duty and Mrs. Orvidson had taken in 3 men as roomers 10 days before the massacre, and their rooming houses were directly across the street from the North Clark Street garage. They picked out mugshots of Purple Gang members George Lewis, Eddie Fletcher, Phil Keywell, and his younger brother Harry, but they later wavered in their identification. The police questioned and cleared Fletcher, Lewis, and Harry Keywell. Nevertheless, the Keywell brothers and by extension the Purple Gang remained associated with the crime in the years that follow. Many also believed that the police were involved, which may have been the intention of the killers. On February 22nd, police were called to the scene of a garage fire on Wood Street where they found a 1927 Cadillac sedan disassembled and partially burned, and determined that the killers had used the car. They traced the engine number to a Michigan Avenue dealer who had sold the car to a James Morton of Los Angeles. The garage had been rented by a man calling himself Frank Rogers, who gave his address as 1859 West North Avenue. This was the address of the circus cafe operated by Claude Maddox, a former St. Louis gangster with ties to the Capone Gang, the Purple Gang, and the St. Louis Gang, Egan's Rats. Police could not turn up any information about persons named James Morton or Frank Rogers, but they had a definite lead on one of the killers. Just minutes before the killings, a truck driver named Elmer Lewis had turned a corner a block away from 2122 North Clark and sideswiped a police car. He told police that he stopped immediately, but was waved away by the uniformed driver, who was missing a front tooth. Board of Education President H. Wallace Caldwell had witnessed the accident, and he gave the same description of the driver. Police were confident that they were describing Fred Burke, a former member of Egan's Rats. Burke and a close companion named James Ray were known to wear police uniforms whenever on a robbery spree. Burke was also a fugitive, under indictment for robbery and murder in Ohio. Police also suggested that Joseph Lolordo could have been one of the killers, because of his brother Pasqualino's recent murder by the North Side Gang. Police then announced that they suspected Capone gunmen John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, as well as Jack McGurn and Frank Rio, a Capone bodyguard. Police eventually charged McGurn and Scalise with the massacre. Capone murdered Scalise, Anselmi, and Joseph Hopto Junta in May 1929 after he learned about their plan to kill him. The police dropped the murder charges against Jack McGurn because of a lack of evidence, and he was just charged with a violation of the Mann Act. He took his girlfriend Louise Rolfe across state lines to marry. The case stagnated until December 14, 1929, when the Berrien County, Michigan Sheriff's Department raided the St. Joseph, Michigan bungalow of Frederick Dane, the registered owner of a vehicle driven by Fred Killer Burke. Burke had been drinking that night, then rear-ended another vehicle and drove off. Patrolman Charles Skelly pursued, finally forcing him off the road. Skelly hopped onto the running board of Burke's car, but he was shot 3 times and died of his wounds that night. The car was found wrecked and abandoned just outside St. Joseph and traced to Fred Dane. By this time, police photos confirmed that Dane was in fact Fred Burke, wanted by the Chicago police for his participation in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Police raided Burke's bungalow and found a large trunk containing a bulletproof vest, almost $320,000 in bonds recently stolen from a Wisconsin bank, 2 Thompson submachine guns, pistols, 2 shotguns, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. St. Joseph authorities immediately notified the Chicago police, who requested both machine guns. He used the new science of forensic ballistics to identify both weapons as those used in the massacre. They also discovered that one of them had also been used to murder New York mobster Frankie Yale a year and a half earlier. Unfortunately, no further concrete evidence surfaced in the massacre case. Burke was captured over a year later on a Missouri farm. The case against him was strongest in connection to the murder of Officer Skelly, so he was tried in Michigan and subsequently sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1940. Many mobsters have been named as part of the Valentine's Day hit team. Two prime suspects are Cosa Nostra hitmen John Scalise and Albert Anselmi. In the days after the massacre, Scalise was heard to brag, "I am the most powerful man in Chicago."
Hated man! Top of the world!
Union Siciliana President Joseph Guinta had recently elevated him to the position of the Union's vice president. Nevertheless, Scalise, Anselmi, and Guinta were found dead on a lonely road near Hammond, Indiana on May 8, 1929. Gangland lore has it that Capone had discovered that the pair were planning to betray him. Legend states that Capone produced a baseball bat at the climax of a dinner party thrown in their honor and beat the trio to death. In 1995, Chicago criminologist Arthur Bilek, who had researched the massacre through FBI files and court transcripts for 30 years, named the participants in the massacre to have been Capone henchman machine gun Jack McGurn, who assembled the murder team that included lookouts Byron Bolton, Jimmy Moran, no relation to Bugs, and Jimmy McCrisson. Their job was to watch the garage and alert Tony Accardo and the other triggermen Fred Burke, Gus Winkler, Freddie Getz, and Robert Carey when Bugs Moran appeared at the site. Another team member, according to Bilek, was Claude Screwy Maddox, who procured the killer's transportation, a car resembling those used by police. With the stage set, Capone and McGurn established alibis, Capone going to Florida. McGurn checked into a hotel with his wife, Louise Rolfe. His claims were backed up by the former FBI agent William Romer, who had heard claims of Tony Accardo also being involved as one of the shooters on several occasions by Murray the Camel Humphreys through a microphone planted in the Chicago tailor shop in 1959.